Hello and welcome to another video trying to get you the very top grades. Today I'm going to teach you these 8 things. We're looking at Utterson and how he's a symbol of manhood which is naturally dual-natured. We're also going to look at how he symbolises hypocrisy and repression, how Stevenson uses irony to deal with his character, and the strange way in which Utterson is shown as being a deliberately boring, he's not quite narrator, but he's the viewpoint that we understand the story through. Why Utterson is attracted to sin and to secrecy. How Stevenson makes use of the fact that he's loyal to his friends no matter how sinful they are. And then the biggie, how Utterson represents all Victorian gentlemen. So he is the target, if you like, of Stevenson's criticism. But when we criticise Utterson, we criticise all Victorian gentlemen. And then finally, 4 added extras, which will get you to grade 8 and 9. Well, if you're interested, let's go. So everything I am going to teach you comes from this single quotation. Yes, it is a long one, you don't have to memorise it, but this is the opening of the novel. And I think there's a good chance that you might get Utterson in the exam. He would be a sneaky question. Right, let's find out why he is a symbol of dual nature. Mr. Utterson, the lawyer, was a man of a rugged countenance that was never lighted by a smile, cold, scanty, and embarrassed in discourse, backward in sentiment, lean, long, dusty, dreary, and yet somehow lovable. He was austere with himself. So we'll pause there, and what I've highlighted in yellow here are archetypally, stereotypically male characteristics. So a man who is described as rugged we would understand as manly, looking like a real man. A man who is backward in sentiment isn't full of their feelings. They don't talk about their feelings much. You see where I'm going with this. He is a typical male. He is also austere with himself. That means he doesn't give in to luxuries. He's really disciplined. He doesn't drink too much. He doesn't eat too much. He keeps himself under control. Right. He drank gin when he was alone to mortify a taste for vintages. So to mortify here means to kill off. A taste for vintages means taste for really fine wines. So the vintage refers to a good year. You know, 1912 was a fantastic year for wine. If you had this particular vintage, this particular type. And though he really loves wine, he thinks it's a weakness in himself to give in to what he likes. And therefore he drinks gin instead, which ironically is much more dangerous because it's far more alcoholic. And in Dickens' time, why am I talking about Dickens? In Stevenson's time, this would have been considered a mark of somebody who is giving in to things they shouldn't give in to. It's quite ironic that he's choosing gin, which is much more addictive for alcoholics, rather than having vintage wines. But he does it in order to stop himself having too much enjoyment. And then we pick up this idea again. And though he enjoyed the theatre, he had not crossed the doors of one for 20 years. So for the last 20 years, since he was probably in his young 30s, he's refused to go to the theatre. Now, partly that's because he is austere with himself. He doesn't want to give in to too many pleasures. But of course, what he wants are manly pleasures, and going to the theatre has a suspicion of femininity. It's all about feelings, isn't it, and performance. And remember up here, he disliked feelings. So in that description, we've got him presented as a typical man, but there is a sense that being a real man is in some way dual-natured. It involves hiding your true self. And that's what Utterson does. He hides the parts of himself that he used to enjoy. They're the parts that really liked a fine tasting wine, that really loved going to the theatre. And he stops himself enjoying that anymore. Right, now we're going to look at the same extract, but this time we're looking at the idea of hypocrisy and repression. So repression means when you take something and you hold it down. In this case, it's the repression of his natural desires, which we talked about earlier. And hypocrisy means pretending to be one thing on the outside, so the public face that you display to people, but being something else completely on the inside, your personal secret face, if you like. So let's look again at repression and hypocrisy. So despite what we've said, he's lean, long and dusty and dreary, makes him sound incredibly boring, and yet he's somehow lovable. So Stevenson is asking us, what would make other people attracted to such a man? And one of the things that's going to make people attracted to him is that he is a hypocrite, and he will be very accepting of other people's wrongdoings, sin in Victorian terms. He'll be accepting of other people's sin. So we've seen the repression before, and I've highlighted in green here how he represses his desires in the theatre. We talked about repressing his desire for wine. Let's look at now what makes him desirable as a companion. He had an approved tolerance for others, so he tolerated other people's, sometimes wondering almost with envy at the high pressure of spirits involved in their misdeeds. So the misdeeds are their wrongdoing, are their sins, and he looks at what they're doing and he notices that they have a high pressure of spirits. In other words, they're super excited by whatever sin they're committing, whether it's adultery or gambling or some actual crime. They're getting massive pleasure from it, which is symbolized with the high pressure of spirits. And he looks on it almost with envy. And we don't fully trust the word almost. We look at this and see that he is actually envious. It's as though he wants their excitement to rub off on him. And that hints at his hypocrisy. So he actually wants to be doing the same sort of misdeeds as his friends, but he holds himself back, perhaps because he fears giving into evil and sin. He still wants to be a good man, even though he naturally isn't. Now, if Stevenson is suggesting that Utterson represents all men, or at least all gentlemen of the time, he's suggesting that all gentlemen suffer from this desire. Many of them give into it, and some of them appear not to, like Utterson, although as you'll see towards the end of the video, he does give in to lots of misdeeds. You have to read the novel closely to work that out. So, in any extremity, he was inclined to help rather than to reprove. So when his friends get into extremity, which means severe trouble, perhaps with the law, or perhaps with blackmail or family, he will help them out rather than criticize them, reprove. So he's loyal, but again, this makes him a hypocrite because he is helping these people get away with the misdeeds which he himself thinks he himself shouldn't do. Yeah, so let's imagine it's adultery. He'd be quite happy to give an alibi to a friend who's been having multiple affairs because he'll help that friend out rather than criticize him. So he's a man without real principles. It was frequently his fortune to be the last reputable acquaintance and the last good influence in the lives of down-going men. So this is our first clue that the story is going to be about down-going men. And obviously, Jekyll is the down-going man who was once reputable but is actually going to end up as Hyde and therefore completely disreputable. But Stevenson is also letting us know that Utterson himself will become not reputable but disreputable. Utterson himself will be one of these going down men. Okay, there is an element of irony in this description as well. So the first thing we discover about Mr. Utterson is that he is a lawyer. He is supposed to be, on the side of the law. But as we just saw, he is attracted to men who are perhaps breaking the law, and therefore he is not who he appears to be. And Stevenson could have given Utterson any profession at all, but he deliberately chose lawyer because it makes it so incongruous that he is willing to cover up misdeeds, and as we will see later, he's willing to cover up crimes. Then we find that he is embarrassed in talking to others. And that's deeply ironic here, because actually he is the social pivot of the novel. All the other men in the novel are drawn to Utterson. He's Dr. Lanyon's friend, he's Dr. Jekyll's friend, he is the one who makes contact with Hyde. Poole comes to seek him out. Even the murdered Sir Danvers Carew is on his way to post Utterson a letter. Presumably he is Sir Danvers Carew's lawyer. So he connects everybody together, and yet he is embarrassed to be in their company chatting to them. Then we have the irony that he is dusty and dreary. He is exceptionally boring, yet people are attracted to him. Well, Stevenson does that on purpose because he makes us ask, what makes him so attractive? And as we have seen, it's because he will turn a blind eye to their sinning, to whatever they're up to that they shouldn't be up to. We talked about the irony of him drinking gin, which makes him a far more irresponsible character than one who suddenly just drunk wine. Because obviously when you drink alcohol, you take many more risks than you would when you don't. And so the higher the alcohol content, the more chances you have of making poor decisions. We talked about the irony of him loving the theatre, but actually forcing himself not to go. And yet, he is attracted to performance. He's attracted to how these people perform with their pressure of high spirits once they have committed their evil acts or their sinful acts, and yet he treats that with envy. The use of the word almost is used ironically here because Stevenson doesn't actually mean, well, it was nearly envy but not quite. What he means is it was so close to envy that actually we might as well call it envy. And then finally this bit here, when he says it was frequently his fortune, fortune at that time meant it just happened to be. So just by chance is what that meant at the time as an expression. But of course fortune also means wealth. And so there is a sense here that Utterson deliberately seeks out men who are on their way down. Why does he deliberately seek them out? Because he is envious for that vicarious pleasure he's going to get in the evil deeds that they're up to. Right, in the next section of my video, I'm going to give you some quotations from Sparknotes. That's a really useful website you can go to. It's free with revision notes, and I'm going to show you how to use them. So Utterson is deliberately boring, and why does Stevenson choose this person to be so dull? That's high risk, isn't it? So how does this help his novel? So this is what Sparknotes says. In a sense, Utterson comes across as an uninteresting character, unsmiling, scanty in speech, lean, long, dusty, dreary in person. As we know from later passages in the novel, he never stoops to gossip. Now actually we find this out quite early when he is speaking to his friend Enfield, and Enfield works out that Hyde went into this door. He's at the back of Jekyll's house, although none of them realise it at that time. But they both agree that they shouldn't find out the identity of the person who wrote the cheque for Hyde. And it's as though they believe keeping a gentleman's secret is an honourable thing to do, even if something untoward is happening, even if people are behaving in an immoral way, they will still keep their identity secret. Yet, this introductory passage also reveals certain cracks in this rigid, civilized facade. So I want you to think about the use of the word civilized, because when Stevenson talks about the duality of man, what he's really saying is that civilization is just a false face. It's a mask. It's a front. And that front and false face is represented by Dr. Jekyll. But it hides what lies within. And so these are the cracks that make Utterson an ideal person to pursue the bizarre case of Jekyll and Hyde. So if you think about this idea of the cracks, Jekyll is the face, the public face, but the crack reveals that behind him is Hyde. Now, what Sparknotes is suggesting here is that Utterson is the perfect person to investigate this story, because he also has the Jekyll and Hyde personality within him. And you can see that quite clearly from the analysis we saw earlier about how he represses his inner desires. His difference, perhaps difference, is that Jekyll doesn't repress his inner desires anymore. He creates his alter ego Hyde to live out those desires, because remember, Jekyll experiences everything Hyde experiences. So really, Jekyll lives Hyde's life that way. But remember, Utterson was almost envious of the experiences of men who are being immoral, like Hyde. And that is a clue that Utterson, like Jekyll, would be just as delighted to have his own Hyde, to be able to live his life through another person whose experiences he could share. So next we discover that Utterson is loyal to his friends no matter how sinful they are. This is what Sparknotes has to say. His lovability may stem from the only interesting quality that Stevenson gives him, namely his willingness to remain friends with someone whose reputation has suffered. Well, we discussed that. This loyalty leads him to plumb the mystery that surrounds Jekyll. So it's out of loyalty to Jekyll that he starts to explore the nature of Hyde. But that's only what's going on above the surface. Beneath the surface, we come to realise that he is plumbing the depths of this mystery because he is actually also attracted to Jekyll's evil. Yet, Utterson represents the perfect Victorian gentleman. Now that, of course, is deeply ironic because that's just his surface appearance. As we've seen, Stevenson is using him symbolically to represent all Victorian gentlemen. So you've probably met the statistic that there were more prostitutes in London during the Victorian period than at any other time. And obviously, who was paying for this enormous trade? Well, it was well-off men. So this gives us this idea of hypocrisy. He consistently seeks to preserve order and decorum. So that's the proper way of behaving, decorum, good word to steal. He does not gossip and guards his friends' reputations as though they were his own. So hopefully you remember that he immediately suspects Hyde has blackmailed Jekyll into helping him, and he assumes that Hyde has some secret piece of information about some sin that Jekyll has committed in his younger days. And in some of my other videos I show you why that is most likely to be homosexuality. So even when he suspects his friend Jekyll of criminal activities, such as blackmail or the sheltering of a murderer, he prefers to sweep what he has learned, or what he thinks he has learned, under the rug, so in other words, keep it secret, rather than bring ruin upon his good friends. Now this is actually really important. Remember that Utterson is a lawyer, but he suspects that Jekyll is a criminal. Well, can you remember what crime Jekyll has committed? This is where Utterson finds out that Jekyll has written a letter which is a forgery. Do you remember? There is the letter that he gives to Utterson, apparently from Hyde, that says, I'm leaving, I'm fleeing, you don't need to look for me, I'm going away and I'll never be found. But we then find out that this, or rather Utterson finds out that this is in Jekyll's handwriting. He's just disguised it. So at that point, he really should go to the police and say, look, you're looking for this murderer of Sir Danvers Carew. We know the murderer was Hyde. Well, I know who's been concealing Hyde. It's Jekyll. Here's my proof he's concealing. He has forged this letter from Hyde in order to throw me off Hyde's scent. Now, that is a criminal act. And Utterson, a lawyer, fails to take Jekyll to the police. He would rather keep Jekyll safe, even though Jekyll knows who murdered Sir Danvers Carew. This is an incredibly criminal and immoral act that Utterson is doing. Why? Because he is attracted to Hyde. He is attracted to Hyde's evil, just as Jekyll is attracted to Hyde's evil. Well, Sparknotes doesn't point that out, but I hope you can see from my reading that that works. Okay, let's look at how Sparknotes suggests that Utterson represents all Victorian gentlemen. Utterson's status as the epitome of Victorian norms, so that's just another way of saying he represents all Victorian gentlemen, also stems from his devotion to reason and common sense. In Utterson's devotion to both decorum and reason, Stevenson depicts Victorian society's general attempt to maintain the authority of civilization over and against humanity's darker side. So what this is getting at is that Utterson exists in a time when the British Empire was at its greatest. So huge numbers of countries in Africa and Southeast Asia all belonged to Britain. And it was fashionable for many people to equate dark skin with sin. So yes, it was a racist time. But at the same time as being racist about these peoples that the British had conquered, they were also deeply attracted to them. So they saw ways of life that they found really enticing. Why? Well, possibly because these ways of life weren't hypocritical. People weren't pretending to be one thing on the outside and then behaving differently in secret. In these other societies, perhaps people were much more free to behave honestly. And that, of course, was very attractive to people who have to spend all their time doing the proper thing. That's what decorum means, where they really want to do something else. And that's just the dilemma that Jekyll and Hyde have. Stevenson suggests that just as Utterson prefers the suppression or avoidance of revelations to the scandal or chaos that the truth might unleash, so too does Victorian society prefer to repress and deny the existence of an uncivilized or savage element of humanity. So Hyde represents the uncivilized and the savage element of humanity. So this was a way of Victorians looking at sub-Saharan Africa, for example, and seeing tribal communities as being savage simply because they had a different way of life to our own. And that's why they looked upon them as uncivilized, because they had different beliefs, they lived in different kind of accommodation, their societies were organised differently. But actually, Victorian society is quite attracted to these even as they repress them. Now, this final Sparknotes quotation is a really useful analysis of structure. So a good way into the structure of the novel is to think, why is Utterson the person whose eyes we see the action from, especially as he is so unimaginative? How does that help Stevenson write a compelling novel? Well, let's find out. Because we see the novel through Utterson's eyes, Stevenson cannot allow Utterson to be too unimaginative. Otherwise, the novel's eerie mood would suffer. You remember all that symbolism about the description of the setting and the chocolate dark sky. You'll see every time you come across a setting, it is symbolic of the duality of man. But enough of that. Correspondingly, Stevenson attributes nightmares to Utterson and grants him ominous premonitions as he moves through the city at night. Well, that makes him imaginative only in his sleep, but in the daytime he doesn't allow himself to be imaginative. So neither of which seem to suit the lawyer's normally reasonable personality, which is rarely given to flights of fancy. Now, this is important because if he were given to flights of fancy with an imagination, he would start coming up with reasons why Hyde exists and why everybody seems instantly to loathe him, enough even to kill him, as Enfield suggests. He would start coming up with theories, but he doesn't. He just comes up with one theory, which is the blackmail. That's important because he invites the reader to go along with that single theory, and that's really useful for Stevenson because then we don't imagine the enormous plot twist when we find out that actually Jekyll and Hyde are the same person. And if he had an imaginative narrator or an imaginative viewpoint in Utterson, we might look for imaginative solutions to who Hyde is, and therefore the final revelation that they are one and the same wouldn't be as much of a surprise. So perhaps the novel suggests the chilling presence of Hyde in London is strong enough to penetrate even the originally rational shell that surrounds Utterson. That's a very long way of saying that Stevenson is looking at the rational and the scientific and saying, what if science is wrong? So science would suggest that we are the pinnacle of evolution, so we have evolved from apes into men. But he's looking at the theory of evolution much more intelligently, because Darwin didn't say that men were evolved to be better than apes. Oh no. Darwin said the species that survive is the one that is best suited to its environment. It is survival of the fittest. So there's no guarantee that man would evolve into a better form of human being. Not at all. The guarantee is that man would evolve into a more powerful form of human being, because the one that is best fitted to the environment will survive. Now we come back to the environment of London. What kind of person will survive best in London? Well, as we have seen, it is the hypocrite, the person who puts on the false face, but who underneath it gets up to all kinds of misdeeds. Okay, now we have the 4 secret things that are going to get your analysis of Utterson into the grade 9. So that dream that we talked about earlier, where he starts imagining Dr. Jekyll asleep and this strange figure over him, which is obviously Hyde, beckoning him to do his deeds. Well, that's Utterson's homoerotic dreaming about Jekyll and Hyde. He's having this fantasy about Jekyll being summoned by another man to do unspeakable things. And so this again is Utterson living out his own desires through 2 other people, Jekyll and the mysterious watcher Hyde. Then we have the significance of his name, Gabriel. This is irony at work again. Gabriel we associate with the angel Gabriel. This was God's right-hand man, if you like. This is the senior archangel. This is the most powerful figure of good amongst all the angels. Well, you can see how ironic that is, because Utterson is only good on the outside. It's only his appearance. And some sophisticated readers also like to argue that Stevenson is calling him Gabriel because he's questioning the values of Christianity at all. He's suggesting actually that all goodness is actually duality. So everybody has good and evil in them. Nobody is wholly good. And then no thing, even angels, he doesn't believe are wholly good. So you can take that interpretation if you wish. Then we need to think about how Utterson Hyde's Dr. Lanyon's account and a Dr. Jekyll's account, both in the form of letters that he receives, and he locks them in his safe to keep them secret. So there is a mystery, a further mystery at the heart of the novel. How do they come out of the safe in order to get published? Very interesting question, isn't it? Does Utterson eventually decide that he should publish them himself? Well, no, because he doesn't write about himself in the first person, does he? So it's as though the author, Stevenson, has snuck into Utterson's safe and then exposed him by stealing these two letters, these two accounts. Then how he is willing to cover up Jekyll's part in hiding the murderer of Sir Danvers Carew, and I've dealt with that earlier in the video. And this is crucial in showing the danger of the hypocrisy of middle-class men. And then there is an autobiographical point that you can write about Stevenson, and that is that he chooses to live away from Britain. Well, why is that significant? Because he is chased away by the hypocrisy he describes. He's so disgusted by the society in London that he goes to a more simple society. He ends up living in Samoa, and this, of course, is, in the words of the day, of course, an area that is savage, an area that is tribal, and therefore the racists of the day would have seen it as inferior. However, not Stevenson. He is attracted to it because it is the geographical version of Hyde. It is a place where people act on their own desires without worrying about sin, without worrying about God or Jesus, what they would want, just acting on their own desires, just as Hyde does. Well, if you've got to the end of the video, you're a bit of a superstar. You're guaranteed a grade 7 or above. Don't forget, the best way to revise this is to take notes, put them in a mind map, put them in an essay. If you want me to mark something, write the essay and post them in the comments below, and I could make a video for you showing you whether or not you've got the grade 8 or the grade 9. So tune in for further videos to get you the top grades, and why not subscribe? Goodbye.